Good evening. Tonight we have a question and answer session. So, first question.
Dear Tan Ajahn, I was listening to your question and answers. Could you please talk about stream enterers that you touched on briefly on the last question and answers session? Is it possible to achieve stream enterer in this lifetime? And what must one do to achieve it? Thank you.
Well, generally all human beings have the opportunity to practice following the Buddhist teachings, the Eightfold Path, and realizing Four Noble Truths in this very lifetime. So can attain stream entry in this lifetime. And indeed it's probably the right goal to aspire to for your life, at the very least to attain stream entry, if not Nibbana. Why else are we here? This is the goal as pointed out by the Buddha, to cultivate the path that he taught for the complete liberation from suffering. And even though stream entry is not yet Nibbana, but it's when the mind of the practitioner has cultivated the path to the point where all the factors of the Eightfold Path have arisen and had their effect on the mind, giving the result, stream entry, and it's like a glimpse of Nibbana. So it's a complete change in the way that person will view themselves, the world, and everything. And it's, in particular, it's like the suffering of somebody who's attained the Noble Path. Stream entry is much, much less than an ordinary unenlightened person. And if we all aspire to the end of suffering, then it's definitely something we should aspire to practice, to cultivate. And it can be done in this very lifetime by both laity and sangha. So don't give up. If you've made that aspiration, keep going. In the end, we don't know how long it will take for our practice to bear fruit, but as long as you don't give up, you keep going, well, sooner or later you'll get there. You'll get to that realization. And the key factors of somebody who's attained stream entry, a stream winner, is that they have abandoned the first three fetters. The way the Buddha talked about human beings and the causes of suffering is sometimes he talk about them as fetters that bind us to the world, to the round of birth and death. And the first three fetters are what the Sotapanna, the stream winner, has abandoned. So that's in particular Sakkaya Ditthi, the attachment to the sense of self, the identification with this body and this mind as a self, and all our experience constantly identifying with that as self. But the Sotapanna has seen through the delusion of self, and the way they view their own body and mind has changed. And seen the attachment to body, mind, or the five aggregates: body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, sense consciousness. They no longer see them as a self, as things that exist or have their own essence and that can be controlled or owned by a self, but see this body and mind as conditioned things that arise according to conditions, pass away according to conditions. So the Sotapanna is practiced to the point where their view of things has changed. The way they view the world, view themselves, has changed. So it's considered a revolutionary moment in one's spiritual development, the development of the mind. And accompanying that, one also abandons silapata paramasa, the blind, unwise attachment to practices, we say rites and rituals, external practices, the wrong grasping of external practices. So assuming a certain practice will guarantee one enlightenment by just attaching to that practice and doing it over and over again, or attaching in a superstitious way to a certain practice or to other aspects of life, so like superstitious attachment to astrology or even feng shui or things that we have in the world, belief in luck and charms and all kinds of different things when believed in a superstitious way. And these are not for the development of the path or development of insight, clear knowledge and vision, but increase our wrong views and misunderstanding of truth. But the Sotapanna has developed the Eightfold Path until they have clear knowledge and vision of the way things are. So they're no longer trapped in superstitious beliefs or wrong views or grasping at different practices in a wrong way. They practice the path and they know they practice the path and they know the result of what they've done. So they have no more doubts. And so that's the third fetter that the Sotapanna has abandoned. No more doubts about the effectiveness of the path to transport the mind of a human being from the state of unenlightened ignorance, suffering, to the state where one is going beyond suffering, at least in part, and one's had a glimpse of Nibbana, so one has that confidence that Nibbana and the end of suffering is a reality. It's possible, and there's no more doubt about the path and what it is and what one has achieved and accomplished. So the Sotapanna has no more doubts in the Buddha, in the enlightenment and the Buddha, the Dhamma, the teachings, and particularly the Four Noble Truths. They've realized the Four Noble Truths, at least on one level. They have no more doubt about the path of practice. They have no more doubt about the Sangha, the existence of the Noble Ones, the value and the worth of the Noble Ones, and the Dhamma of the Noble Ones. No more doubt about that, because they've now got their own faith based on confidence, based on their own practice and experience. So they're no longer just relying on the words of others or belief in theories and philosophies and so on. They're no longer reliant on the belief in, say, a god or gods or supernatural beings. Through their own experience, they've understood the path and how it actually works to free the mind from suffering. And they can see the value of noble ones, others who have also attained to the path, because they explain the same kind of phenomena and experiences that one has had, the Sotapanna has had. So there's a certain correlation and connectedness on that level, talk about the same thing, describe the same kind of insights. Nevertheless, it's a private experience. You know, Sotapanna knows for themselves what they've done, what they've practiced, their state of mind, how peaceful it is, what they've abandoned, what they haven't abandoned. They have that clarity, whatever anyone else says, or whether they meet other people or not. And they have their own understanding. And there are other qualities that the Sotapanna will have developed. So they say the stream winner will have abandoned macharya, stinginess. So they have a basic generosity, willingness to help others empathize with others, share what they have with others. So, as Buddhist monks, we have a rule. One of our rules is that if we know a layperson to be a sotapanna, we have to be very careful about how we treat them, not to ask them and bother them for things, because a sotapanna has established right view, and they understand the value of giving alms, and they have this natural generosity. So if a Buddhist monk who they respect and support comes along and says, I need this, I need that, they'll tend to give, maybe even give to their own detriment or the detriment of their family. So a Buddhist monk or nun would have a responsibility not to exploit that generosity or overdo it. So we even have rules guiding that. And the stream enterer, stream winner, they have generally, their grounding in morality is established. They have no more intention to break the 5 precepts, to kill intentionally, to steal, to commit acts of sexual misconduct, to speak lies or practice wrong speech, the different kinds of wrong speech, or to take intoxicants or drugs, because they value mindfulness and insight above states of intoxication. So it's quite natural for the sotapanna to keep the 5 precepts. And there's various other qualities they develop. They develop right view, right understanding of what is good karma, bad karma, and they're constantly practicing accordingly. So they haven't completely abandoned all their defilements. They still have subtle states of greed, anger arise, maybe attachment to states of samadhi, subtle conceit of I, some subtle restlessness in mind, and there's still some ignorance in the mind, because these are the other 7 fetters which later on they abandon in the path of practice. But they understand what mental defilement is when it arises, and then they practice accordingly. So when mental defilement is identified, it's always to be abandoned. There's no doubt about that. There's no lingering doubt, should I hold on to this greed or this anger? They recognize it for what it is, as the cause of suffering. So there are many profound changes take place in the mind of the sotapanna, all for the good of themselves and for others. So it's a great blessing to meet a sotapanna, but of course you might not know if you meet one. And in this day and age, there have still been even lay people believed to have been sotapannas. You might never know for sure, but some great teachers, such as Luang Por Man, did occasionally mention that certain individual lay people had practiced well and developed the path in their life. And we believe Luang Por Man to be an arahant, so maybe somebody who's qualified to recognize a sotapanna. And so there were 1 or 2 laymen, lay women who he mentioned had attained that stream entry in this very life. One of them I remember, Luang Por Kamdam, who ordained later in life, but in his earlier life, this is in northeast Thailand, he was a farmer and had great faith in Luang Por Man and the other forest ajahns, meditation masters. So he supported them whenever he could and listened to their teachings and trained himself in sila and meditation. And he took on the meditation practice using the meditation word Buddho, which is from Buddhanusati, the recollection of the Buddha. And he would practice meditation and mindfulness in daily life, not just in formal meditation, but he'd practice mindfulness as he ploughed his fields, as he went about his daily business. He would recite Buddho to develop mindfulness in all postures. And they say he became a sotapanna as a layman. He had a wife, he had family, and eventually his mind was so inclined towards Nibbana and the realization of Nibbana And as he got older, I think maybe around the age of 50 or so, he decided to go off, leave the home life. His kids have grown up, his wife was well looked after, so he left his home to go off and become a Buddhist monk and practice for Nibbana. And there are others, I won't mention here, but they do exist, so it's quite possible to develop the insight into stream entry, stream winner in this very life. The important thing is to keep practicing and don't give up. And another quality of a stream winner is that they're scrupulous with their practice of their training in sila and development of right view and insight. So they're very quick to admit their faults because they want to change their habits for the better. So when they do fall into wrong thinking, unwholesome mental states, say, they'll quickly recognize them, even discuss them with a teacher, or if someone points out a fault to them, they'll tend to adjust very quickly because all they want is to develop the path for Nibbana. So they're not ones who always are finding excuses and blaming others for their suffering, but they're keen to remedy their own suffering. And because they've let go of Sakkaya Ditthi, they're not always creating a sense of self out of the suffering or the issues that arise in their life. They have this sense of a more detached awareness of their own body and mind, and rather than making everything into a problem or blaming other people for their troubles, they tend to be using their experience as a basis for insight and letting go of attachment. So they say the Sotapanna lives with an attitude of forgiveness. So even if other people harm them deliberately or by accident, they'll forgive. They won't hold on to a grudge, and they won't seek revenge or form some kind of vendetta. They'll let go of grudges because they know that doesn't help them, doesn't help the other person. And they say the Sotapanna has closed off the doorways to the lower realms, rebirth in the lower realms, hell realms, animal realms, ghost realms, because they've established their mind in morality and this intention to cultivate the wholesome, abandon the unwholesome.
Dear Ajahn, could you please explain the term bound by dukkha and obstructed by dukkha? This is found in the morning chanting. Specifically, what does it mean by the term obstructed by dukkha? Thank you.
Well, it's the emphasis on the fact that we are bound by dukkha. Dukkha surrounds us in every aspect of our experience as human beings. As Lumpur Buddhadasa used to say, it's ready to bite us at any moment. Any moment dukkha can arise in our mental experience or our physical experience of the world. There's probably not a single day goes by where we have absolutely no experience of pain, discomfort, suffering arising. There'll always be something. But there's many kinds of dukkha. Particularly practicing the Buddhist path, we're interested in the dukkha that we talk about in the Four Noble Truths. That is the experience of pain, suffering that arises from the experience of an ignorant mind, ignorant of the Four Noble Truths, unmindful, unwise, falls into craving, which is a cause for clinging and attachment and becoming, birth, and the experience of dukkha arises. And the Four Noble Truths also give us the Fourth Noble Truth, the path that leads to the end of suffering, so the remedy to dukkha. There's other kinds of dukkha, like just the living in the world. There's the dukkha of the fact that everything is subject to change. All formations are conditioned things, so they arise and they pass away according to conditions, and that's often uncontrollable. So living in the world, there's so much we can't control. The weather, the other people, our health, what's going on around us, the environment, and so on. There's plenty that we can't control. So we're surrounded by dukkha. So we're bound up by internal dukkha of having a human body, which is subject to aging, sickness and death. Subject to bound up with dukkha of the mind, which when it's untrained or we're unmindful, falls into negative states of suffering of different kinds very easily, all the time. And we're bound up with dukkha of the world around us, what other people do, the environment, the weather and the economy and all these things. So we're bound up with dukkha. It's part of the experience of the human realm that we live in. And a lot of that dukkha can obstruct us. So like, for example, over the years, I've seen many people come to a monastery and they want to practice the Dhamma to improve their mind, to develop the precepts, mindfulness, insight. And maybe within a day or two, they fall ill, or they have an accident, or someone rings up and say they've got to go home because mum or dad is ill or something. Dukkha affects us out of the blue all the time, and then it will stop us, obstruct us from pursuing that which is good. It could be our own health changing on us, deteriorating on us. Just as you book in to do your 10-day retreat and then you break your leg, can't go. These things happen. Dukkha is like that. It's just ready to bite us at any moment, and it will obstruct us from doing good. It could be something much more fleeting. So maybe you're just about to do an act of goodness and you have a negative thought arise, a doubt, a worry, a distraction. So it could be this very evening you're about to sit down and do some chanting and meditation, watching Facebook with the monks, but then a thought comes up and says, but there's something good on Netflix. And the mind gets caught into a doubt, some restlessness, which is dukkha, a mild dukkha, and maybe the desire for Netflix or something else wins because that seems more attractive at the time to get away from some mental dukkha. And that's going on all the time in our day. Little moments of dukkha obstruct us from being mindful, obstruct us from being generous or kind. Could be our own internal mental proliferation arising, or it could be someone else. Someone comes along and says something to you that you disagree with. He may put you into a negative mood. You might get irritated, angry with them, and that dukkha arises and obstructs you at that moment from doing the right thing or doing something that you're doing. Like when you get angry, you're angry because someone's criticized you, say, then it's hard to concentrate. So maybe you're trying to do some work and you can't concentrate because of this angry mood you've fallen into. You're obstructed by dukkha. Or you're meditating and you get some pain in your knee and you're trying to meditate but you can't deal with this pain very well, so you stop meditating and go off and have some food or talk to your friend. So dukkha is like that. It's always lurking in the background. Things change and dukkha arises. So it's always ready to bite us. So we always have to be alert. But at the same time, dukkha is our teacher. And every moment of dukkha, every aspect of dukkha can be a teacher for us if we treat it properly. And a lot of the path is about developing the skills to understand, recognize dukkha for what it is, to see dukkha as dukkha. And then it becomes a noble truth. Or practicing insight meditation, you're contemplating the dukkha as a characteristic of phenomena, physical phenomena, mental phenomena, the way things change, deteriorate all the time, the unsatisfactory side of existence. That's also a vehicle for developing wisdom, insight. So even though dukkha, by its nature, it tends to be painful, unpleasant, difficult, when we treat it properly, we develop mindfulness, clear comprehension, and the reflective side of the mind, and learn to ponder it, contemplate it, investigate it. It can become the source of wisdom. And wherever dukkha arises, wisdom can arise if we bring up mindfulness and contemplate it. And that dukkha can be seen as impermanent as well. So the experience of dukkha can arise and then it can cease very quickly when we bring mindfulness and wisdom to bear on it. So often people have that question, they say, where's the best place to practice? What's the right practice to do? How should I practice? Ajahn Chah used to say, well, wherever dukkha arises, that's where you have to extinguish the dukkha. That's where you have to practice. You have to let go of that, the causes of that dukkha right there in your mind at that time. And that's the place of practice. That's what your number one priority is. So dukkha is unpleasant, obstructive, it's a burden, but at the same time it becomes a noble truth when we treat it properly. And when you have insight, it's the sense of self-identity with that dukkha, it's disappearing, and dukkha just becomes dukkha rather than my dukkha, my problem, the problems of the world or somebody else that's making me have problems and blaming them. The sense of self-identity disappears when we develop the path of mindfulness and insight, and that changes our relationship to dukkha.
Luang Por, we often start metta practice beginning with ourselves, then radiating the metta externally. Could you please speak on self-compassion in the practice, specifically in relation to Sila, Samadhi, Panya? Thank you, Luang Por.
Well, you could say if once you have some faith and confidence in the Buddhist path, the Buddha's teachings, that brings with it that aspiration for peace and to go beyond suffering. And then when you bring up that aspiration, and that could be a daily reflection, you think, what is the point of life? Why am I here? What's my goal in life? You might answer that saying, well, my goal is to develop the path to the end of suffering, to experience peace and happiness. So then what is the most compassionate thing to do for myself is to develop that path, because suffering is suffering, it's painful, it's unpleasant, we don't like it, we don't want it. What's the most compassionate thing I can do for myself as a human being? Well, is develop the causes to go beyond and end suffering. And similarly, when you think of others, what's the most useful thing for them is to encourage them to develop the same path that will be a cause for them to end their suffering. So that's one of the reasons I came to become a Buddhist monk, is I thought, well, what's the most useful thing I can do in my life for myself, for others? Well, follow the Buddhist path. I had the faith in the Buddha and his words and his teachings, faith in Ajahn Chah as a practitioner of the teachings. I couldn't think of anything better to do with my life or any other real purpose in life. Everything else seemed very second best, very limited. Say, earning money, gaining knowledge, gaining experience of life, the pleasures of the world, however good they seem. To me, they just faded into unimportance when set next to the Buddhist path for the ending of suffering. So what is the most compassionate thing we can do for ourselves is the practice of sila, samadhi, panya, developing the Eightfold Path. But on a day-by-day basis, of course, there are times when we get caught into wrong views and all kinds of negative emotions, and mental suffering will come up, which sometimes obscures the path or leads us in the wrong direction. So this is why the Buddha encouraged us to practice the Brahma Viharas, so the practice of kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy and equanimity. These are 4 meditations to develop on a daily basis, because sometimes we lose these qualities under the pressure of different kinds of dukkha, different kinds of suffering, unpleasant experiences, unwanted experiences that come into our life, whether it's physical suffering or mental. Our goodwill and our compassion can disappear. It's not always there. So we have to keep regenerating it, re-establishing it, redeveloping it, which is why we often do a meditation every day on loving kindness and compassion. And I'd recommend that because it's a good antidote, especially if you do it first thing in the morning. Develop the meditation on goodwill, compassion for oneself first, because what do you know best in life? You know yourself. Even though some people do have a lot of self-hatred, we have to start chipping away at that wrong view that is self-hatred and start replacing it with some compassion, some goodwill towards oneself, because that will help our day, our life go better. And it may take time, but if one meditates on this every day, then that's where that kind of a change in attitude can come. If one is developing goodwill every day as a practice, that will break through some of that self-hatred or depression, unhappiness centered around the sense of self and the grasping at those kind of negative thoughts. It will help to replace them with more better thoughts, goodwill, and also to see that negative thoughts of self-hatred are just thoughts. They're just mental states that arise and pass away and can be abandoned. Because often when we're caught into self-hatred and anger, we don't see that it's something to be abandoned, we just think we're stuck with it. So meditation is helping to change that way of looking at our experience. And it's a lot easier to have goodwill for others if we're developing it for ourselves. So that's why traditionally, usually we practice goodwill, metta meditation with ourselves first. But one can also experiment if one's finding it hard developing metta for oneself. Well, pick somebody that you find it easy to have metta for. So it could be a child, your child, could be a pet, could be a person that you easily love and respect, a parent, a partner, a friend. If you need to, in the beginning, maybe you do that first, develop the goodwill and compassion towards someone else, or maybe someone who you know who is suffering and you wish them well because they're ill or suffering in one way or another. If that's what you need to start the process and get that feeling of goodwill or compassion developed in your mind as a mental state, well, so be it. You can try that. But you also want to be feeding that back to yourself and recognizing that all human beings are the same. Yourself, others, we're all in the same boat. We feel pain just the same. We want to be happy just the same. But we're all owners of our karma, so people are at different stages in their life, their spiritual development. But we all aspire to the same basic idea of wanting to be happy. So your aim in these meditations is to develop what we call universal loving kindness, universal compassion, and keep working at it until one can establish that as a feeling, an emotion, a thought, and a meditation object that one genuinely can have in the mind and develop it regularly. Because it's an antidote to falling into states of anger, hatred, contempt for others. Or if one does fall into those states, it's helping one to quickly come back to the thought of goodwill or compassion because one is developing it regularly. It's a thought that we're familiar with and used to. If you've never done this kind of meditation, then it might be a totally strange thought to have goodwill for oneself or others, and it will take a lot of work to develop it and become used to it. Often we feel we're judgmental of ourselves or another person who we don't like, and we think they don't deserve it, I don't deserve it. We have to get over that hurdle, and then we'll appreciate the value of this practice. So practicing it on a daily basis, even looking for occasions in one's day to practice goodwill in a simple way through speech, through action, helping others, and then meditating on it when one has some quiet time just to sit and reflect on one's life and develop goodwill for oneself and for others as a meditation. And particularly if you know someone who is suffering and you're feeling helpless, that you can't help them, well, one thing you can always do is meditate for them. So say at the moment when there's coronavirus, you may know somebody who has it and you're not allowed to visit them, they're in a hospital ward somewhere, all you can do is wish them well, and we can do that as a meditation. There was somebody who's been to our monastery a few times who got the coronavirus in Melbourne, was in the Melbourne hospital, and the wife contacted us. We can't visit them, but we can meditate and chant for them, and we did. And that person has now come out of hospital and has recovered from coronavirus. So it's something we can do for somebody far away or somebody in a situation that you can't see them face to face, talk to them, but you can still meditate for them. Anyone suffering in this world, whether it's here or miles away, you can do this. And I recommend you do it, you practice it.
Luang Por, recently in the evening puja, the Sangha chanted the Noble Eightfold Path Sutta. In the sutta, there's a part that states mind object. May I ask, what is mind objects?
Well, literally, objects of mind, as described. I believe that verse was, we're reciting the teaching on the four foundations of mindfulness, one of the Satipatthana Sutta that the Buddha taught, which is to direct one's mindful awareness to the body, to feelings, to the mind, and then we say mind objects. So it's only the Arahant, one who's reached Nibbana, has completed this practice of the four foundations of mindfulness. And the last part that you would complete would be the development of awareness directed to mind objects, because mind objects covers such a wide area of our experience. And one needs very refined mindfulness, clear comprehension, and reflective wisdom to really penetrate and to see particularly the impermanence and the lack of self in all mind objects, all phenomena that come back to the mind to be known by the mind. In particular, it refers to the areas of practice that will help us to penetrate the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are included in mind objects. So these are to be realized and known, but also the five aggregates that make up a human being, the six spheres of sense consciousness, so that's our eyes and the consciousness that arises with eyes, ears and sounds, nose and smell, tongue and taste, body and touch. So the five, and then the mind is the last. But particularly the mind objects is related to understanding the causes of suffering, to become fully mindful of all of those, and particularly how suffering manifests in the mind. So the five hindrances that we talk about a lot when practicing and developing samadhi. So sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and skeptical doubt. These are the hindrances to the mind developing states of calm, concentration, stillness. How do they arise? How are they abandoned? That's practicing mindfulness of mind objects, becoming fully mindful of those hindrances and fully aware of them, their arising, their origination, their cessation. And also the 7 factors of enlightenment, the 7 bojjhanga. So mindfulness, investigation of Dhamma, energy, tranquility, concentration and equanimity. So it's both the good and the bad, developing full awareness of how suffering arises, and say how it manifests in the clinging to the 5 aggregates or the 5 hindrances that block samadhi, and then how the positive qualities that we develop, how the bojjhanga, the 7 bojjhangas, factors of enlightenment, arise, how they're sustained and developed, and how ultimately they lead to us becoming, to realizing the 4 Noble Truths. So a vast area of mind objects to develop mindfulness of, but in short, it's suffering, how it arises and how it ceases. Another way you could refer to it is the paticca samuppada. Yeah. They talk about the 12 factors of the paticca samuppada, dependent origination in its forward and reverse mode. So how suffering arises in these 12 factors of dependent arising, and then how it ceases when these are abandoned. So clinging is abandoned, craving is abandoned, leads to the end of suffering. So in brief, the development of mindfulness of mind objects is what brings one to Nibbana, understanding suffering, how it arises, how it is to be abandoned, and to be fully mindful of the abandonment or the cessation of suffering. So a bit technical, that term, but in practical terms, we are actually developing mindfulness of mind objects every day. In the beginning, we tend to do it just thinking, pondering about the Dhamma, learning the Dhamma, listening to the Dhamma, reflecting on it. And it has to be that way because that's how we operate as human beings. We have a thinking mind, we string concepts together, we learn and memorize things. That's fine, but for the noble one who's really practicing on a very refined level for Nibbana, they would be practicing direct awareness of mind objects as mind objects. So understanding fully how the hindrance of sensual desire arises, how it is to be abandoned, or how mindfulness arises, how it's maintained and developed, and so on. They're practicing this through direct awareness, no longer just memorizing, theorizing, thinking about it, but actually observing and being fully aware of these things.
Dear Tan Ajahn, could you please explain the meaning of the middle way? I've heard different explanations of this. Thank you.
Well, it's the first thing the Buddha taught. In the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, after his enlightenment, he taught what is not the middle way, Kama Sukhalikanu Yoga, the attachment, clinging to sense pleasures and seeing the indulgence in sense pleasures and pursuing the happiness of sense pleasures, thinking that will bring you ultimate, lasting, perfect happiness. It's the abandoning of that wrong view. And then Atthakilamattanu yoga, the attachment to clinging to the view of, we say, self-mortification, self-harm, extreme asceticism that doesn't lead to the arising of wisdom, insight, peace of mind. These two extremes of human behavior, and particularly sort of belief systems, and they were current in India at the time of the Buddha, and they're still prevalent in the world today. It's the abandoning of them and taking up the middle way of practice, which is the Eightfold Noble Path. And the middle way isn't just the middle point between these two extremes of sensual indulgence and self-mortification. It's the path that leads to the goal which you want, which is the end of suffering, the complete extinction of suffering, complete end of samsara, the cycle of birth and death, reaching the unconditioned. That's your goal, and that's the goal of the middle path. And that's how you judge whether you're on the middle path or not, or whether it's leading you to that goal or not. So it doesn't mean to say sometimes you might enjoy some sense pleasures while you're on the path, as long as they don't disrupt your practice of the path or make you stray from the path. Doesn't mean to say you aren't sometimes more ascetic in your approach and take on certain ascetic practices, as long as they don't become a clinging to a wrong view or an end in themselves. We always have our higher goal, which is to reach the unconditioned and train the mind to experience that, develop the Eightfold Path. But as you're going along that, well, you might sometimes we experience pleasure. You can still eat pleasant food. It won't necessarily make you stray from the path, but you have to watch yourself, because it's easy to get greedy for nice food. Someone was saying today that New Zealand, they've been coming out of lockdown today, so what did everyone do? They ran to the fast food stores to get their snacks that they've been missing for the last month. So it's like they've been coming out of extreme asceticism, now they're going towards indulgence. So hopefully everyone will get back to the middle way in the next few days and eat a balanced diet. It's like that, isn't it? As we actually practice and develop the path, we tend to sway from side to side, but we have these two extremes that help guide us. It's a reflection. Am I being too extreme? Is it bringing me to the purpose of reducing my attachments, my clinging, my kilesas, greed, anger, delusion, or am I increasing it? You see this in monasteries. Sometimes monks become very idealistic and gung-ho, and they say, I'm sleeping too much, so I'm going to go without sleep. And they maybe can do it for a period of time, but then they become very grumpy and unpleasant to live with because they're not getting enough sleep. Or others might fast for a long time, think, I'm going to give up my attachment to food. The Buddha fasted, I'm going to fast. And they also become very weak and grumpy or very sleepy. One can experiment with different practices, but one has to be looking at the result of the practices one does and saying, are these reducing my attachment, my wrong views, my greed, my aversion, or increasing it? And the same with sensuality. Sometimes we go the other way. We just become indulgent, sleep too much, eat too much, watch too much Netflix, whatever it is that takes us away from the path. And then we have to wake ourselves up and say, this is not the middle way anymore. I'm going to the way of indulgence. And it's only going to lead to more attachment, more delusion, more deeply ingrained in defilements, more greed and selfishness and so on. So that love of truth, honesty with what we're doing, and the ability to assess and review our practice is important to develop. And we have to accept sometimes we go stray to the left, stray to the right. Ajahn Chah used to say it's like with water buffalo. If you live in northeast Thailand, you'll see the farmer or his son taking the water buffalo out to the fields every day, and their job is to keep the water buffalo on the track, because you can't let it go into the neighbour's field and start eating his rice plants. So when the water buffalo does that, the farmer will shout at it, say, "Hey," and get it back on track so it doesn't indulge too much. Ajahn Chah said it's a bit like that. You go to the left, you have to shout, "Come back." If you go to the right, you shout, "Come back." And our practice is like that. Until we are absolutely clear on what is the path, what is not, we have to use the middle way as a guideline. And that's a skill we learn with experience.
And the final question this evening is, I am living with a friend who suffers from anxiety. This is bringing up a lot of stress and disagreements in our relationship during this pandemic. Is there a way of living together with harmony and peace? Thank you.
Well, I imagine this is a very common experience at the moment. If we are unable to travel, maybe can't go to work, lost income, we're afraid of going out, meeting people and catching disease, and so on. Many people are bound to be suffering some anxiety, fear, frustration. And even if there isn't coronavirus, people often will experience this anyway. Living in the world, pressures of lifestyle, social relationships, work, making ends meet, and so on. So this is again coming back to the practice of metta, karuna, or goodwill and compassion. I'd recommend as a starting point, or just develop these qualities both as a meditation and in your thinking and the way you relate to this person. If someone's suffering anxiety, they don't need more pressure, more aversion, more problems. So try to relate to them with goodwill, compassion, understanding, generosity. And what you find is these qualities make our own heart softer, more peaceful, more happy inside, and that will have a good effect on the people we live with. It won't take away all the problems, but it will give us a good attitude to deal with those problems and that person. And the Buddha said when you practice goodwill, then your speech tends to reflect it. We practice goodwill, we will then speak beautiful speech, what we call biya vaja. Beautiful speech that is kind, helpful, sensitive to the other person. And if you're living two people in an apartment or whatever, well, that's going to be essential for some peaceful time, is to speak well to each other, try to avoid being harsh, being unkind, cruel, aggressive in the way we speak to each other, even when we disagree with each other. As far as disagreements, well, that is the thing that splits people apart, is the attachment to views and opinions and the sense of self. So any meditation technique done regularly will help us become more aware of our attachment to the sense of self, our ego, our attachment to views and opinions. And if we can understand how we're attaching to our own views with a sense of self, then we can empathize and understand the other person more based on our own experience. And particularly we can see a view is just a view. It may be right, it may be wrong. And our views change all the time with different information, different situations. Over just a short period of time, our view on something can change dramatically. If you start observing yourself, becoming more aware of how you are holding on to views and how they affect you, well, you'll see that. And that helps you to loosen some of the attachment to your own views of what is right, wrong, good, bad, because you know that can change. It doesn't mean to say you can't have a view, but your relationship to your own views and opinions will change the more you investigate and develop awareness. And then you can use that, employ that understanding as you relate to another person. So the more similar our views, the better things will go. If we can have similar outlooks on things, living with other people, well, that will lead to more harmony. But where you differ, we'll try not to let it come into be a cause for conflict and dissatisfaction, but to have respect for the other person, try to find some kind of understanding through skillful speech, and you do your best. But if you can develop more inner peace, contentment, that will help in how you deal with the person, people you live with. Patience will also help. I often remember one teacher I used to know very well, Luang Por Put. He said when he was a young monk, he had lots of aversion for some of the other monks in the monastery. He was living in a monastery, and you live as a community, so there'll be some monks you like, some you don't like in particular, because of different habits, different outlooks on things. So he noticed this was a problem, and he was set on purifying his mind, abandoning anger, and he realized his attachment to his own views and opinions was a problem, because it was stirring up anger for him. When he was relating to some of these other monks he didn't get on so well with. And he said his natural intention or inclination was to spend time with the monks he liked and get on well with, and avoid the monks he didn't like. When he was first in the monastery, that's how he thought. But then pondering this, he thought, but this is only going to harbour and increase my attachment to my own views and opinions and preferences, and continue to produce problems with other people who I disagree with or don't like. That I won't get beyond that mental defilement or that situation. So he devised his own practice for this. He actually made a vow to spend his time with the monks he didn't like, to teach himself to let go of his own conceit and attachment to views. And he did this so well. He was spending, when he had any kind of social interaction or work projects or whatever things he had to do with other monks, he was always spending his time with the monks he didn't get on well with. And he actually started to find he had things in common with them, and the aversion was disappearing, and he was becoming friends with those monks. But then his original friends started to feel neglected and say, oh, you never spend time with us, because he did it so well, he wasn't spending time with his normal friends. They didn't quite understand what he was doing. He only told them later. But he was quite successful in this, and he said his aim was to get to the point where he could be with any monk in the monastery, whether he liked them or not, agreed with them or not, and be at peace with himself and that monk. And he found that really helped his meditation progress. He could get into states of samadhi because he gave up complaining about others, being frustrated with others, thinking negatively about others. He just learned to let that stuff go and develop more kindness, contentment, and acceptance of people around him. So maybe that's a good lesson. That's how an expert does it. He did it very well, and we believe he became an arahant, so it obviously worked for him. So time has gone on. Maybe we'll leave the question and answer session there for today. We'll wish you all well in your practice. May you be safe and protected, blessed by the Triple Gem. And we'll see you next time. And we'll just pay respects to the Triple Gem together now.